The smell of burnt toast and drip coffee was the only thing anchoring Helen Parker to the present. Outside the frosted window of their modest Pacific Northwest kitchen, the Washington State morning was painted in bruised shades of purple and gray. Rain lashed against the glass in a rhythmic, relentless drumbeat that, on her worst days, reminded Helen of distant gunfire. But today was not a bad day. Today was a Tuesday, and on Tuesdays, 7-year-old Chloe wore her yellow rain boots. "Mom, you burnt it again," Chloe said, her voice a bright, melodic chime that instantly shattered the creeping shadows in Helen's mind. Helen blinked, pulling her gaze away from the dark tree line beyond their backyard. She looked down at the charred square of wheat bread sitting on the ceramic plate. She offered a small, crooked smile, the one reserved only for her daughter. "Tactical error. Bug," Helen said, smoothly sliding the ruined toast into the trash and dropping 2 fresh slices into the toaster. "The enemy engaged with superior thermal weaponry. But we'll win the counterattack." Chloe giggled, a sound that made the hollow ache in Helen's chest recede. Chloe didn't know the reality of the words her mother used. To her, they were just silly games. She didn't know about the 2 tours in Helmand Province. She didn't know about the improvised explosive device that had turned Helen's Humvee into a cage of fire and shrapnel, leaving Helen with a slight limp in her left leg and a bronze star she kept hidden in a shoebox at the back of her closet. Chloe only knew that her mom was her hero, her protector, and the absolute worst cook in King County. "Peanut butter this time?" Chloe asked, swinging her legs under the table, the bright yellow boots thumping softly against the chair. "Copy that," Helen said, her voice softening. She leaned over and kissed the top of Chloe's head, inhaling the scent of strawberry shampoo and innocent warmth. This was her mission now. Not securing perimeters, not clearing compounds, but this. Keeping this tiny, beautiful light safe in a world that Helen knew, firsthand, was drowning in the dark. 10 minutes later, they were in Helen's battered but meticulously maintained Ford F-150. The engine roared to life with a comforting, guttural growl. Helen ran her hands over the steering wheel, her thumbs automatically finding the worn grooves at 10 and 2. Her eyes scanned the mirrors. Left side, clear. Right side, clear. Rear view. Just Chloe, buckling herself into the backseat with her pink backpack clutched to her chest. "Ready to roll, soldier?" Helen asked, adjusting the heat. "Operation Third Grade is a go." Chloe cheered. Helen shifted into drive, and the heavy tires crunched down the gravel driveway. As they turned onto Route 119, the atmosphere shifted. Route 119 was a 40-mile stretch of 2-lane blacktop that snaked through the dense, towering evergreens of the Snoqualmie Valley. Locals called it the Devil's Ribbon. The trees here grew so thick and tall that they formed a canopy over the asphalt, blocking out the morning sun and trapping the coastal fog. The mist hung heavy and low, swirling across the road like desperate, grasping fingers. Helen hated this road, but it was the only route from their rural cabin to the elementary school in town. She reached out and turned the radio dial. Keeping the volume low, a local news anchor's voice crackled through the speakers, cutting through the hum of the heater. "Authorities are expanding the search perimeter for 29-year-old Jessica Thorne, who failed to arrive for her shift at the diner yesterday morning. This marks the third woman to vanish along the Route 119 corridor in the past 6 months. Sheriff Davis urges residents." Helen's hand shot out, snapping the radio off. The silence in the cab became sudden and heavy. 3 women. First, it was Sarah Evans, a real estate agent whose car was found idling on the shoulder back in October. Then, Maria Lopez in December, a nursing student whose abandoned bicycle was discovered tossed into a ravine. And now, Jessica. Civilians looked at these events and saw tragedies. They felt a vague, chilling sadness, locked their doors at night, and hoped the police would figure it out. But Helen wasn't a civilian. The military had rewired her brain, turning her into a machine that constantly sought out patterns, anomalies, and threats. 3 women, all between the ages of 25 and 35, all disappearing during the early morning hours, swallowed by the dense fog of Route 119. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone, like they had been erased from the earth. A predator is hunting in my backyard, Helen thought, her jaw clenching. Her eyes, cool and analytical, scanned the tree line as the truck ate up the miles. He uses the fog for cover. He knows the blind spots. He's organized, disciplined, and patient. Mom, why did you turn it off? Chloe asked from the backseat, her voice tinged with confusion. Just static, baby, Helen lied smoothly, forcing her grip on the steering wheel to relax. Hey, do you want to practice your spelling words? Okay, ask me a hard one. All right, how about environment? As Chloe began spelling the word, Helen's hypervigilance went into overdrive. The fog was thicker today than it had been all week. Visibility was down to less than 50 yards. The towering Douglas firs on either side of the road looked like silent, towering sentinels watching them pass. They rounded Dead Man's Curve, a sharp, blind turn flanked by a steep drop-off on the right and a solid rock face on the left. Helen automatically eased off the accelerator, her foot hovering over the brake. That was when she saw it. It wasn't much. A civilian would have missed it entirely. Their eyes glued to the white line painted on the asphalt. But Helen saw the anomaly. Off to the right, half swallowed by the thick, gray mist and parked at a jarring angle on the gravel shoulder, was a blue sedan. Helen's heart gave a slow, hard thump against her ribs. Her right foot pressed the brake pedal just enough to slow the truck to a crawl. Environ, Chloe continued, oblivious to the sudden tension radiating from the driver's seat. Helen's eyes darted over the scene, taking it apart piece by piece, analyzing it with cold, tactical precision. The sedan's driver's side door was wide open, hanging out over the white line. The hazard lights were blinking, casting an eerie, rhythmic orange glow against the fog. Breakdown? Helen thought. Maybe, but why leave the door open toward traffic? She scanned the surrounding area. The ditch, the tree line, the shadows. Nothing. No driver standing by the hood with a cell phone. No one walking down the shoulder. Just an empty car with an open door, screaming into the mist. Mom, you stopped, Chloe noted, peering out the rain-streaked window. Are we helping someone? Every instinct in Helen's body, the oath she took to protect, the deeply ingrained medic training, screamed at her to pull over. Draw the concealed 9mm Glock from the lockbox under her seat. And clear the vehicle. Someone could be hurt. Someone could be bleeding out in the damp grass. But then she looked in the rearview mirror at Chloe. Her daughter's wide, innocent blue eyes were looking back at her. First rule of survival. Her old platoon sergeant's voice echoed in her head. You don't engage an unknown threat when you're carrying precious cargo. No, Bug, Helen said, her voice tight but controlled. "We're staying in the truck." She reached down and hit the master lock switch on the driver's door. Click. The sound of the doors locking felt deafening. Helen pressed the accelerator, steering a wide berth around the abandoned sedan. As the F-150 crept past the open door, Helen's eyes raked the interior of the blue car. A purse was spilled on the passenger seat. A travel coffee mug sat in the cup holder. And dangling from the ignition, keys swinging slightly as if the driver had just stepped out seconds ago. "It's a trap," her instincts roared. "It's bait." As the truck moved past the sedan and the red taillights faded into the fog behind them, Helen glanced up at her rearview mirror one last time. Her breath caught in her throat. For a fraction of a second, the fog parted. Standing perfectly still just inside the tree line, 10 yards behind the abandoned car, was a figure. A man. He was tall, dressed in a heavy dark raincoat, his face obscured by a lowered hood and the swirling mist. He wasn't looking at the blue sedan. He was looking directly at Helen's departing truck. A chill, colder than the Washington rain, spiked down Helen's spine. The hair on her arms stood up. She didn't look away until the fog swallowed him whole, erasing him as if he had never been there at all. Helen didn't speak. She didn't panic. She reached under her seat, her fingers grazing the cold steel of the biometric lockbox holding her sidearm. The police were looking for a ghost. But Helen Parker knew from bitter experience that ghosts didn't bleed. And they didn't lay traps. Only monsters did. And this monster had just made the fatal mistake of looking her in the eye. Snoqualmie Valley Elementary School was a fortress of bright, primary colors and noisy chaos. Sitting entirely at odds with the gray, suffocating dread Helen had just navigated, as she pulled the F-150 into the drop-off line. The rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers felt like a countdown clock ticking in her chest. "Okay, Bug," Helen said, putting the truck in park. She turned in her seat, forcing the cold, analytical soldier back into a mental lockbox and plastering on the warm, reassuring smile of a mother. "Perimeter secured. You are clear for deployment." Chloe unbuckled her seatbelt with a loud clack, her yellow rain boots hitting the floor mats. She grabbed her pink backpack, completely untouched by the heavy, silent terror her mother had just experienced. "Do I have to do math today?" Chloe asked, wrinkling her nose. Helen chuckled, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of brown hair behind Chloe's ear. Her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second against her daughter's warm cheek. "Math is just solving puzzles. Chloe, you find the missing pieces. And the picture makes sense. You're great at puzzles." "Yeah, but puzzles don't have fractions," Chloe grumbled, pushing the truck door open. The cold Washington rain immediately rushed into the cab, bringing with it the smell of wet pavement and damp cedar. "Hey," Helen said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave. Chloe stopped and looked back. "What's the rule?" Chloe sighed, reciting the words she had been taught since she could talk. "Head up, eyes open, stay with the squad. Good girl. I love you to the moon. Love you to the stars. Mom." Chloe slammed the door and skipped toward the brick building, joining a stream of other children navigating the puddles. Helen didn't move. She kept the truck in park, the engine idling, her eyes locked on Chloe's yellow boots until they disappeared safely behind the heavy glass double doors of the school. Only then did she let the breath out of her lungs in a long, shaky exhale. The smile fell from her face. The mother vanished. The soldier returned. Helen reached down to the center console and grabbed her phone. She didn't bother with 911. The regional dispatchers would just route her through a maze of questions and put her in a queue. Instead, she dialed a direct number. It rang 3 times before a gravelly, exhausted voice answered. "Davis. Marcus. It's Helen Parker." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. Sheriff Marcus Davis was a good man. A 30-year veteran of the force who was currently drowning in a sea of media pressure and missing persons files. He and Helen had a mutual respect. He had been the one to help her navigate the VA paperwork when she first moved back to the valley. "Helen, tell me you aren't calling about a stray dog again. I've got the FBI breathing down my neck and the mayor on line 2. "Dead man's curve," Helen said, her voice clipped, stripping away the pleasantries. "Westbound shoulder. I just passed a blue sedan. Late model. Maybe a Honda or a Toyota. Driver's door wide open into traffic. Hazard lights on. Keys in the ignition. Purse on the seat. Abandoned." The silence on the phone was immediate and heavy. Helen could hear the squeak of Davis's leather chair as he sat up straight. "Are you sure, Helen? Did you see anyone?" Helen closed her eyes. The image of the tall, hooded figure standing in the swirling mist burning behind her eyelids. The way he hadn't looked at the empty car. The way he had watched her. "No driver," Helen replied carefully. She decided to keep the man in the woods to herself for now. If she told Davis she saw a ghost in the fog, he'd write her off as a paranoid vet seeing phantom combatants. She needed him to focus on the tangible. But it felt wrong. "Marcus. The staging was off. It looked like bait. I'm dispatching Deputy Miller right now," Davis said, his tone entirely professional now. "Did you stop?" "I had Chloe in the truck. I kept moving." "Good. Don't go back, Helen. I mean it. Go home. Lock your doors. Let my guys handle the perimeter." "Copy that," Helen said. She hung up the phone. She looked at the elementary school one last time, ensuring the perimeter was quiet, then shifted the truck into drive. She turned out of the school parking lot. But she didn't turn right, toward the safety of her rural cabin. She turned left, back toward Route 119. "Don't go back," Davis had said, but Davis hadn't seen the man in the trees. Davis didn't understand the tactical reality of what was happening on his highway. The police were treating these disappearances like random acts of opportunity. Helen knew better. That open car door wasn't an accident, it was a carefully calculated choke point. The predator was testing the waters, seeing who would pull over, who would be foolish enough to step out of their vehicle to be a good Samaritan. Helen reached under her seat. The biometric pad on the steel lockbox flashed green as it read her thumbprint. The lid popped open. She pulled out the 9mm Glock 19. The cold polymer frame felt familiar, grounding her. She checked the magazine, fully loaded with hollow points, racked the slide to chamber around, and slipped the weapon into the concealed holster at her hip. The drive back to Dead Man's Curve took 12 minutes. The fog had begun to thin out slightly, turning from a dense wall of gray into wispy, localized patches that drifted across the blacktop like smoke. Helen slowed the F-150 as she approached the blind curve, her heart rate steadying into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. Her eyes scanned the right shoulder, looking for the blinking orange hazard lights. She rounded the curve. Helen slammed on the brakes, the heavy tires skidding slightly on the wet asphalt before coming to a halt. She stared through the windshield, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. The shoulder was empty. There was no blue sedan. No open door. No blinking lights. Just wet gravel and the silent, towering wall of Douglas firs. Impossible, Helen whispered to the empty cab. It had been less than 30 minutes since she drove past. Even if a tow truck had been called immediately, they couldn't have responded, loaded the vehicle, and cleared the scene this fast. And if the driver had magically returned and driven off, why leave the car in such a vulnerable, precarious state to begin with? Helen checked her mirrors. The road behind her was empty. The road ahead was empty. She threw the truck into park. Leaving the engine running and the headlights cutting through the gloom, she stepped out into the freezing rain, her right hand resting casually over her jacket, just inches from the grip of her Glock. Her combat boots crunched against the gravel as she walked to the exact spot where the blue sedan had been. Math is just solving puzzles, she had told Chloe. You find the missing pieces. Helen crouched down, her eyes tracking the ground. The rain was washing away evidence by the second, but she could still see the deep, aggressive tire tracks in the soft mud of the shoulder. They didn't belong to a blue sedan. They were wide, deep-treaded marks, a heavy-duty truck or a large SUV. The vehicle hadn't driven away. It had been loaded up or dragged. The scene hadn't been abandoned, it had been scrubbed. Helen stood up, moving closer to the tree line where she had seen the hooded figure. The brush here was thick with thorny blackberry bushes and decaying ferns. She moved methodically, letting her eyes unfocus slightly, scanning for anomalies in the natural pattern of the woods. There, caught on the low, jagged branch of a dead blackberry bush, just an inch above the mud, was a small, unnatural glint of black plastic. Helen knelt, ignoring the thorns that scraped against her waterproof jacket. She used the tip of a pen from her pocket to lift the object free from the thorns. It was a heavy-duty industrial zip tie, the kind used by riot police to bind wrists. But this one had been modified. The inside track of the plastic loop was smeared with a thick, translucent gel. Helen leaned in, sniffing cautiously. Petroleum jelly, to keep the thick plastic from leaving friction burns on the skin, preventing the victim from realizing they were bleeding until it was too late. Helen stared at the zip tie, the reality of the situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't just a serial killer. This was a professional, someone who understood staging, rapid extraction, and tactical restraint. A siren wailed in the distance, echoing off the rock face of Dead Man's Curve. Deputy Miller was arriving. Helen slipped the zip tie into an evidence bag she kept in her medical kit, tucked it into her pocket, and walked back to her idling truck. She wasn't going to tell Marcus Davis about the zip tie. The police were playing checkers, following standard operating procedures and filling out forms. But the man in the woods was playing chess, and Helen Parker was tired of watching from the sidelines. She climbed into the F-150, locked the doors, and drove away just as the flashing red and blue lights of the cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror. The hunt had begun. Helen's cabin sat at the end of a long, unmarked dirt driveway, flanked by ancient cedars and entirely invisible from the main road. To anyone else, it was a quaint, rustic retreat. To Helen, it was a fortified bunker. She had retrofitted the solid oak doors with reinforced steel strike plates, installed shatter-resistant film on the ground floor windows, and set up a closed-circuit camera system that covered every blind spot on the property. She pulled the F-150 into the detached garage, the heavy wooden doors groaning shut behind her, sealing her in. Once inside the house, she bypassed the cozy living room with its stone fireplace and headed straight for the basement. The air down here was cool, smelling faintly of gun oil, pine sawdust, and old paper. She flicked a switch, and a row of harsh, fluorescent LED shop lights buzzed to life, illuminating her workspace. Against the far concrete wall hung a massive corkboard. Until today, it had been a disorganized collage of Chloe's finger paintings, grocery lists, and utility bills. With a sweeping motion of her arm, Helen cleared it all away. She walked over to a heavy steel workbench. Pulling the plastic evidence bag from her pocket, she dropped the modified zip tie onto the metal surface under a high-intensity magnifying lamp. The translucent gel smeared on the inner plastic teeth gleamed under the light. Petroleum jelly, she confirmed again, to prevent friction burns. In her years deployed overseas, Helen had seen how insurgents moved high-value targets. You didn't care about friction burns if you were planning to kill someone quickly. You only padded the restraints if you needed the asset alive, quiet, and capable of walking without leaving a trail of blood. The man in the raincoat wasn't a disorganized thrill killer. He was a harvester, and he had a holding location. Helen turned to her desktop computer. She fired up a virtual private network, masking her IP address, and began pulling up everything she could find on the 3 missing women. She bypassed the sanitized local news reports and dug into the raw data, public county tax records, social media archives, and the digital footprints left behind by Sarah Evans, Maria Lopez, and Jessica Thorne. She printed their photos, pinning them in a horizontal line across the center of the corkboard. Target 1. Sarah Evans, 34. Real estate agent. Disappeared in October. Her silver Lexus was found idling on the shoulder of Route 119 at 6:15 a.m. Target 2. Maria Lopez, 26. Nursing student. Disappeared in December. Her bicycle was found in a ravine off Route 119 at 5:30 a.m. Target 3. Jessica Thorne, 29. Diner waitress. Disappeared yesterday. No vehicle found, but she walked to work along a 2-mile stretch of Route 119. Shift started at 5 a.m. Helen picked up a red marker, drawing a thick line beneath the times. 5 a.m., 5:30 a.m., 6:15 a.m., pre-dawn, Helen muttered to the empty room. Low visibility, minimal civilian traffic, maximum fog density. She printed a topographic map of the Snoqualmie Valley, pinning it above the photos. With a black marker, she marked the exact GPS coordinates where Sarah's car and Maria's bike were found. Then, she marked the diner where Jessica was supposed to arrive, and the apartment she had left. Finally, she marked Dead Man's Curve, where she had seen the blue sedan and the hooded figure just an hour ago. She stepped back, her eyes tracking the black X's on the map. The police were treating the highway as a 40-mile stretch of random danger. But Helen saw the geometry of the hunt. The X's weren't random, they formed a clustered, 5-mile operational zone. He's not driving up and down the highway looking for victims, Helen whispered, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. He's static. He's waiting for them to come to him. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Route 119 was a gauntlet. And this 5-mile stretch was the kill zone. The killer knew the terrain perfectly. He knew where the cell phone dead zones were. Dead Man's Curve was notorious for having zero signal. He knew how the fog rolled off the Snoqualmie River, creating natural visual cover that defeated headlights and dash cams. Helen looked back at the zip tie. Then she looked at the map. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the basement. The blue sedan. If the blue sedan this morning was a trap, an anomaly meant to lure a good Samaritan out of their car, then the killer was evolving. He wasn't just taking women who happened to break down or ride their bikes in the dark anymore. He was actively manufacturing the breakdowns. He was fishing. And Helen had driven right through his net. She glanced at her watch. 10 a.m. Chloe wouldn't be done with school until 3 p.m. She had 5 hours. Helen moved to the heavy steel gun safe in the corner of the basement. She spun the combination dial, left, right, left, and pulled the heavy door open. She bypassed her hunting rifles and the old service shotguns, reaching for a heavy, olive-drab Pelican case sitting on the bottom shelf. She hauled it onto the workbench and popped the latches. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, were 4 high-definition, motion-activated tactical trail cameras. They were military-grade, equipped with no-glow infrared flashes that were completely invisible to the naked human eye. If Sheriff Davis and his deputies were going to treat the highway like a standard crime scene, Helen was going to treat it like a combat zone. She checked the lithium batteries in each unit, formatting the encrypted SD cards. She packed the cameras into a canvas rucksack, along with a roll of matte black camouflage tape, heavy-duty paracord, a tactical flashlight with a red light filter to preserve her night vision, and her Ka-Bar combat knife. "You want to own the dark?" Helen said softly, staring at the topographic map, visualizing the dense, dripping tree line of Dead Man's Curve. "Let's see how you like being watched." She zipped the rucksack shut. The hunter had spent 6 months stalking the women of the valley, moving like a ghost through the fog. But he had made a critical miscalculation. He hadn't realized that the fog belonged to Helen, too. Helen didn't park at Dead Man's Curve. Doing so would announce her presence to anyone watching, be it a passing county deputy or the monster she was hunting. Instead, she drove 2 miles past the curve, turning her F-150 onto a forgotten, overgrown logging road. The truck's heavy suspension absorbed the deep, muddy ruts until she was completely swallowed by the dense canopy of Douglas firs and western hemlocks. She cut the engine. The silence of the forest immediately pressed in on the cab, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the steady, drumming rain on the metal roof. Helen sat still for 60 seconds, letting her eyes and ears adjust. The dull ache in her left leg, a souvenir from the blast in Helmand Province, throbbed in the damp, freezing air. She ignored it. Pain was just data. It meant she was alive. She stepped out of the truck, the cold biting through her waterproof jacket. She swung the heavy canvas rucksack over her shoulder, checking the retention on her holstered Glock one last time. The hike back to Dead Man's Curve was a grueling, 2-mile trek through unforgiving terrain. Helen moved parallel to the highway, staying 50 yards deep in the tree line. She didn't walk like a civilian hiking a trail. She moved like a ghost, placing the outside edge of her boot down first before rolling her weight to the inside to avoid snapping twigs. It was an old infantry trick, muscle memory kicking in to guide her through the rotting ferns and slick, moss-covered deadfalls. It took her 45 minutes to reach the elevation directly above the curve. Below her, Route 119 was a slick, black ribbon winding through the mist. The spot where the blue sedan had been staged was perfectly visible. From this vantage point, Helen could see the sinister brilliance of the location. The rock wall on the opposite side of the road bounced sound in a way that made it impossible to tell where approaching vehicles were coming from until they rounded the corner. Cell service was entirely dead, and the steep drop-off meant there was nowhere to run. It was a fatal funnel. Helen lowered herself to a crouch, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She opened her rucksack and pulled out the first tactical trail camera. She strapped it to the trunk of a massive cedar, 10 feet off the ground, angling the lens downward to cover the gravel shoulder. The matte black casing made it virtually invisible against the dark bark. She moved 20 yards north, placing the second camera to capture the road's approach. A third went 50 yards south to cover the exit. Overlapping fields of view. If a vehicle stopped here, or if someone stepped out of the woods, she would capture their face, their license plate, and their direction of travel. She had one camera left. Helen turned her back to the highway and looked deeper into the woods. If I were him, she thought, slipping into the cold, calculated mindset of a sniper. Where would I wait? He wouldn't stand exposed near the road for hours. He needed a hide, a place with a clear line of sight, cover from the rain, and an escape route. She moved higher up the ridge, the incline growing steeper. The trees here grew so close together that the light was reduced to a murky, underwater twilight. Then, she saw it. It was a cluster of massive, uprooted pine trees that had fallen against one another decades ago, creating a natural, cave-like structure beneath their intertwined root systems. From the front, it looked like a solid wall of dirt and dead wood. But as Helen crept around to the backside, her heart began to hammer a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The brush had been cleared away, not by nature, but by human hands. Helen drew her Glock, thumbing off the safety. She sliced the pie, moving in a slow, calculated arc around the opening, her weapon trained on the dark void beneath the roots. Clear, she breathed, stepping into the hollow space. It was dry inside. The dirt floor had been patted down smooth. But it was what she found in the center of the hide that made the blood freeze in her veins. Resting on a flat stump was a heavy, black thermos. Next to it were 3 discarded wrappers of high-calorie protein bars. But the most chilling detail was the view. Through a small, fist-sized hole carved meticulously through the root wall, Helen could see directly down to the gravel shoulder of Dead Man's Curve. It was a sniper's nest, a viewing gallery. Helen knelt, her eyes scanning the dirt. She found a boot print, size 12. Deep treads, heavily worn on the outside heel. She pulled her phone from her pocket and snapped several photos. The flash turned off. Then, her eyes caught something carved into the thick bark of the trunk supporting the roof of the hide. She leaned in, shining her red-filtered tactical light onto the wood. There were tally marks, deep, aggressive slashes cut into the bark with a serrated blade. 1, 2, 3. Sarah, Maria, Jessica. Helen's breath caught in her throat. The media and the police were searching for a kidnapper, hoping these women were locked in a basement somewhere. But you don't carve tally marks for captives. You carve tally marks for kills. And then, she noticed the final detail. Just below the 3 vertical slashes, the wood was still raw, the sap fresh and sticky. It was a 4th mark, a horizontal slash, waiting to cross the other 3. He had already chosen his next target. He was just waiting to spring the trap. Snap! The sound was sharp and distinct, echoing through the damp air outside the hide. It wasn't the sound of settling wood or a falling branch. It was the sound of a heavy boot breaking a dried twig. Helen instantly killed her flashlight. Total darkness swallowed her. She froze, silencing her breathing, sinking to one knee in the dirt. Her Glock was raised, her finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. She listened, her ears straining against the ambient noise of the rain. Crunch. Leaves compressing. Slower this time. Deliberate. Someone was walking up the ridge. Someone who knew exactly where they were going. Helen's mind raced. She was trapped inside the hide. If he came around the front, they would be face to face in an enclosed space. A firefight here would be messy, unpredictable, and lethal. She thought of Chloe, sitting in her classroom, practicing her spelling words. Head up, eyes open, stay with the squad. Helen couldn't die here in the dirt. She refused to leave her daughter alone in a world that contained men like this. She holstered her weapon, sliding her bar knife from its sheath at her hip. In close quarters, a blade was silent and didn't jam. She pressed her back against the earthen wall, melting into the deepest shadow of the root cave, waiting for the monster to come home. The silence in the root cave was absolute, save for the blood roaring in Helen's ears. Crunch. Squelch. The heavy boots were just outside the entrance now. 10 feet away. Then 5. Helen pressed her spine so hard against the damp earthen wall that she felt the jagged rocks biting through her waterproof jacket. She didn't look at the entrance. Looking meant exposing the whites of her eyes. A rookie mistake that had gotten good soldiers killed in the dark alleys of Kandahar. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the dirt floor, her peripheral vision catching the sudden, drastic shift in light. A shadow fell over the opening of the hide. He was here. The air pressure in the small space seemed to change, growing heavier, suffocating. Then came the smell. It wasn't the scent of unwashed clothes or sweat. It was the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil, peppermint, and bleach. It was the sterile, calculated scent of a man who meticulously cleaned up his messes. Helen tightened her grip on the leather handle of her bar knife. The blade was 7 inches of blackened 1095 Crovan steel. If he stepped inside, she would have a fraction of a second. Target the femoral artery or the subclavian. Fast, brutal, and definitive. Breathe, her training whispered. 4 seconds in, hold for 4. 4 seconds out. The shadow shifted. The man crouched, bringing his face closer to the opening. Helen could hear the wet fabric of his raincoat crinkling. He was breathing heavily, a slow, rhythmic rasp that sent a spike of primal terror straight into Helen's marrow. He didn't step inside. He paused. Helen watched a single, thick finger, clad in a black neoprene tactical glove, reach out and touch the frame of the entrance. He brushed against a fern that Helen had accidentally bent when she slipped inside. He noticed it, the slight anomaly in his carefully curated environment. The man tilted his head. Helen couldn't see his face beneath the deep cowl of his hood. But she felt his gaze sweeping the dark interior. He was listening. He was hunting. He reached toward his hip. The unmistakable sound of a Kydex holster unsnapping clicked through the damp air. He was drawing a weapon. Helen shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, preparing to launch herself forward. For Chloe, she thought, locking the image of her daughter's yellow rain boots in her mind. I will not let you make her an orphan. Suddenly, the ground beneath them violently trembled. A deafening, Mechanical roar shattered the stillness of the forest. Down on Route 119, a massive logging truck was barreling into Dead Man's Curve, laying heavily on its jake brake. The staccato, thunderous popping echoed off the rock face, vibrating up the ridge and filling the air with deafening noise. The man flinched, his head snapping toward his viewing hole. The sudden, overwhelming noise had broken his concentration. He stood up swiftly, taking 2 steps toward the front of the root cave to look down at the highway. His back momentarily turned to the dark recess where Helen crouched. It was a 3-second window. It was all she needed. Helen didn't hesitate. She didn't make a sound. She pivoted, sliding through a narrow, jagged fissure in the rear of the root system that she had mentally logged the moment she entered the hide. Roots tore at her jacket. A broken branch scraped a hot, bleeding line across her cheek. She ignored it, forcing her body through the dirt and wood, tumbling out into the freezing mud on the backside of the massive fallen tree. She didn't stop to breathe. She stayed low, practically crawling on her hands and knees through the thick underbrush, putting distance between herself and the sniper's nest. 50 yards, 100 yards. Only when she was completely swallowed by the dense cover of a cedar grove did she finally push herself up to a run. Her legs pumped, the old injury in her left knee screaming in protest. But adrenaline fueled her forward. She navigated the treacherous, slick terrain with the desperate precision of a ghost escaping a graveyard. 20 minutes later, Helen broke through the tree line and saw the dull silver grille of her F-150 waiting on the logging road. She hit the unlock button on her key fob, threw open the door, and practically fell into the driver's seat. She slammed the door shut, hitting the master lock. Her hands were shaking violently. She dropped the car bar onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel, resting her forehead against the cold leather. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, the sterile scent of bleach and peppermint still phantom haunting her nostrils. "I'm alive," she whispered to the empty cab. "I'm alive." She turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, the heater blasting warm air over her freezing, mud-soaked clothes. She threw the truck into reverse, desperate to get off the mountain, to get back to the safety of her fortified cabin, to pick up Chloe and never let her out of her sight. Then, her cell phone chimed. It was a sharp, high-pitched ping that cut through the rumble of the engine. Helen froze. She reached into her pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out the phone. The screen was lit up with a notification from the encrypted tactical app she had installed that morning. Motion detected. Camera 2, north approach. Helen's thumb hovered over the screen. Camera 2 was strapped to a tree right above the fatal funnel of Dead Man's Curve. She tapped the notification. The app loaded a high-definition, black and white infrared photo. Helen stared at the screen, the blood draining completely from her face. It wasn't a picture of a passing car. It wasn't a deer. It was the man in the raincoat. He was standing directly in front of the camera, looking straight into the lens. His hood was pushed back just enough to reveal the lower half of his face. He was smiling. But that wasn't what made Helen's heart stop. It was what he was holding up to the camera. Dangling from his black neoprene glove was a single, brightly colored piece of fabric. Helen recognized it instantly. It was a pink, star-shaped zipper pull. The exact zipper pull that had broken off Chloe's backpack 3 days ago. The one Helen thought she had lost in the gravel of their driveway at home. He hadn't just been hunting on the highway. He had been to her house. He knew who she was. He wasn't just hunting the women of the valley anymore. He was hunting them. The phone slipped from Helen's numb fingers, clattering onto the floor mats. The hunter's calculus had just changed, and the war had finally followed Helen Parker home. The pink, star-shaped zipper pull burned on the screen of Helen's phone like a radioactive warning. For 2 seconds, the world completely stopped. The sound of the rain, the rumble of the F-150's engine, the throbbing ache in her leg, it all vanished, swallowed by a roaring vacuum of absolute maternal terror. He was at the house. He has her zipper pull. The soldier in Helen's mind, the cold, calculating tactician who had survived IEDs and ambushes, stepped up, violently shoving the panicked mother aside. Panic is a civilian luxury. Her old platoon sergeant's voice barked in her head. Action dictates survival. Move. Helen stomped on the accelerator. The heavy Ford truck fishtailed wildly in the mud, its rear tires throwing massive roosters of brown sludge into the air. Helen wrestled the steering wheel, her knuckles turning bone white as she forced the vehicle onto the narrow, overgrown logging road. Branches whipped against the windshield like grasping claws. But she didn't hit the brakes. She hit the blacktop of Route 119 at 60 miles an hour. The truck's suspension screamed in protest as she took the sharp left turn toward town. Helen grabbed her phone from the floor mat, her thumb jabbing at the screen. Ignoring the cracked glass, she hit speed dial. Rain, rain, rain. Snoqualmie Valley Elementary. This is Brenda. How can I? Brenda. It's Helen Parker. Chloe Parker's mother. 3rd grade. Mrs. Gable's class. Helen's voice was clipped, carrying a terrifying, metallic edge of command. Oh, hi Helen. Is everything okay? You sound out of breath. I need you to physically lay eyes on my daughter right now. Brenda, do not put me on hold. Walk to her classroom and tell me she is sitting at her desk. Helen, honey, it's 1:15. They're at recess in the gymnasium right now because of the rain. I can't just. Brenda, listen to me very carefully. Helen interrupted, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper as she pushed the truck up to 80 miles an hour, weaving recklessly around a slow-moving logging rig. If you do not walk into that gymnasium and confirm my daughter is safe, I will call Sheriff Davis and tell him there is an active threat inside your building. Do it, now. There was a stunned, breathless silence on the other end of the line. Okay, Helen, I'm going. Stay on the line. Helen listened to the frantic clicking of Brenda's sensible heels against the linoleum floor. The 3 minutes it took felt like 3 lifetimes. Helen navigated the slick, winding turns of Route 119 with aggressive precision, her eyes scanning the tree line, expecting the man in the raincoat to step out at any moment. Helen? Brenda's voice came back, slightly winded. I'm here. She's here. She's sitting on the bleachers playing cat's cradle with the little Miller girl. She's perfectly fine. Helen let out a ragged exhale, the tension bleeding out of her shoulders so fast she almost slumped against the steering wheel. Thank God. Listen to me, Brenda. Pull her out of the gym. Bring her to your office. Lock the door. Do not let anyone, and I mean anyone, take her. I am 5 minutes away. Helen didn't wait for a response. She dropped the phone and focused on the road. When the red brick building of the elementary school finally broke through the fog, Helen didn't bother looking for a parking spot. She jumped the curb, throwing the F-150 into park directly on the front walkway. Blocking the double doors, She didn't turn off the engine. She vaulted out of the truck, her hand instinctively brushing the concealed Glock at her hip as she sprinted toward the entrance. She burst through the heavy glass doors, the security buzzer screaming in protest. The front office was quiet, smelling of laminating plastic and stale coffee. Brenda, a sweet, older woman with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, jumped up from her desk. Standing right beside her, clutching her pink backpack, was Chloe. "Mom." Chloe smiled, looking completely unfazed. "Are we going home early?" Brenda gave me a butterscotch. Helen fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around her daughter, pulling her small, warm body flush against her chest. She buried her face in Chloe's shoulder, inhaling the scent of strawberry shampoo, her hands frantically patting the little girl's back, checking for harm. "I've got you, bug," Helen choked out, her voice cracking. "Mom's got you." "Helen, you're scaring us," Brenda said softly, her hands fluttering nervously. "What on earth is going on? Did something happen at the house?" Helen stood up, keeping a firm grip on Chloe's hand. She forced her features into a mask of calm, though her eyes scanned the office lobby, checking the corners, checking the windows. "We had a security breach at the property." Helen lied smoothly. "I'm pulling her out for the rest of the week. I need you to lock down her file." "Brenda, only I am authorized to pick her up. No emergency contacts. No exceptions." Of course," Brenda said, hurrying over to her computer. "I'll update the system right now. Oh, by the way." Brenda paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She looked up, offering a polite, confused smile. "I'm so glad you got the lunchbox sorted out. Your husband was just so polite about it." The air in the room instantly turned to ice. Helen stopped moving. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and clammy. She looked at Brenda, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband?" "Yes." Brenda nodded, gesturing toward the front counter. "About an hour ago. A tall gentleman in a dark raincoat. He said Chloe forgot her lunch on the kitchen counter. He dropped off a brown paper bag for her. I put it in her cubby before recess." Helen's heart slammed against her ribs like a sledgehammer. An hour ago, while she had been up on the ridge, trapped inside the root cave, the monster hadn't just been checking his trail cameras. He had come to the school. He had walked right through the front doors. "Brenda," Helen said, her voice shaking with a terrifying, suppressed rage, "I am a widow. My husband died in Afghanistan." Brenda's polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. "Oh my God, Helen, who was that? Where is the bag?" Helen demanded, stepping forward, her tactical mindset snapping completely into place. In classroom 3B. Her cubby." "Call Sheriff Davis," Helen ordered, pulling Chloe firmly behind her. "Tell him to initiate a full tactical lockdown. Nobody in or out. Do it now." Helen didn't wait. She unholstered her 9mm Glock, keeping it pointed down at the floor, and dragged Chloe down the brightly lit hallway. The colorful posters of the solar system and cursive letters blurred past them. She reached classroom 3B. It was empty, the lights off while the kids were at recess. Helen pushed the door open, sweeping the room with her eyes. Clear. She walked over to the wooden cubbies lining the back wall. Chloe's name was written on a bright green piece of construction paper. Sitting inside the cubby was a standard brown paper lunch bag. Helen holstered her weapon and put her hand out. stopping Chloe from getting any closer. "Stay right there. Bug. Don't move." Helen stepped up to the cubby. She didn't touch the bag. She leaned in, looking inside. The top wasn't rolled shut. Inside the bag, resting on the bottom, was a single item. It wasn't a sandwich. It wasn't an apple. It was a small, heavy-duty industrial zip tie. The inside track of the plastic loop was smeared with a thick, translucent gel, petroleum jelly. Beside it lay a folded piece of white paper. Helen reached in with 2 fingers, her hands steady despite the earthquake in her chest, and pulled the paper out. She unfolded it. Written in neat, precise block letters was a single sentence. "I can take her whenever I want. Stop looking." Within 10 minutes, Snoqualmie Valley Elementary School looked like a war zone. 3 county sheriff's cruisers were parked haphazardly on the front lawn, their light bars painting the brick facade in frantic, strobing flashes of red and blue. The rain had picked up again, a freezing downpour that matched the icy dread settling over the building. Inside the principal's office, the air was thick with tension. Chloe was sitting on a vinyl couch in the corner, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the situation, eating her butterscotch candy and watching a cartoon on Brenda's iPad with oversized headphones over her ears. Helen stood by the window, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She watched Sheriff Marcus Davis storm into the room, shaking the rain off his heavy jacket. His face was pale, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. "Helen," Davis said, his voice a low rumble. "Brenda said a man came into the school. Claimed to be your husband." Helen didn't say a word. She reached into her jacket pocket and tossed a clear plastic evidence bag onto the principal's desk. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. Davis frowned, stepping closer. He looked down at the brown paper lunch bag, the heavily greased zip tie, and the folded note inside the plastic. He read the block letters upside down. "I can take her whenever I want. Stop looking." "What the hell is this, Helen?" Davis whispered, the color draining entirely from his face. "That," Helen said, her voice dead and flat, "is the man taking your women on Route 119. And he just walked right past your deputies, into a building full of children, and left a calling card in my daughter's cubby." Davis ran a hand over his face, looking suddenly much older than his 55 years. "How do you know it's the Route 119 guy? This could be a stalker. Someone from your past, maybe someone from your unit?" Helen pulled her phone out, tapped the screen, and shoved it toward Davis's chest. The infrared photo of the man in the raincoat, holding Chloe's pink star zipper pull, glowed in the dim office light. "I tracked him," Helen said, her tone devoid of apology. "While your deputies were filling out paperwork for abandoned vehicles. I went up the ridge at Dead Man's Curve. I found his sniper hide. He has a viewing portal looking down at the highway. Marcus. And he has 3 tally marks carved into the wood. 3 marks for 3 missing women. He's already carved the 4th. He was waiting for his next target." Davis stared at the phone, then at the zip tie. His police training was desperately trying to catch up to the tactical reality Helen had already mapped out. "You went into the woods alone? Helen, are you out of your mind? You compromised a crime scene." "I found the crime scene," Helen snapped, stepping into Davis's personal space. The soldier was fully in command now. "He's adapting. Marcus. He realized I was hunting him. So he bypassed me and went straight for my weakest flank. He came for Chloe." Davis let out a heavy sigh. nodding slowly as the terrifying puzzle pieces snapped together. Okay, we bring the FBI in now. This is a targeted threat against a minor. I'm putting you and Chloe in protective custody. I'll get you to a room at the Marriott over in Bellevue. Put 2 armed deputies outside your door until we sweep that ridge and catch this son of a bitch." Helen looked at Davis. She liked him, but right now, she pitied him. "No," Helen said. "Helen, this isn't a debate." I said no. "Marcus, a hotel room is a soft target. Dry wall, glass windows, multiple points of entry, and civilian collateral everywhere. Your 2 deputies are good men. But if they go up against a ghost who knows how to move in the dark and smear petroleum jelly on zip ties to muffle his victims, they will be dead before they can unholster their weapons." Helen walked over to the couch, gently pulling the headphones off Chloe's ears. "Come on, Bug. We're Oscar Mike. Time to go home." "Home?" Davis stepped in front of the door, blocking her path. "Helen, he knows where you live. He found her zipper pull at your house. If you go back to that cabin, you are walking into a siege." Helen looked up at the older man. Her eyes were not filled with fear. They were entirely black, cold, and resolved. "I know," Helen said softly. "That's exactly what I'm counting on. He thinks he's the hunter. He thinks he can use my daughter to scare me into backing down." She brushed past the sheriff, her hand resting protectively on Chloe's shoulder. "Let him come to my house in the dark. Marcus," Helen whispered as she opened the office door. "Let him see what happens when the prey shoots back." The drive back to the cabin was conducted in absolute silence. Helen took a circuitous route, executing 3 counter-surveillance loops to ensure they weren't being followed. By the time the heavy tires of the F-150 crunched onto their dirt driveway, the Washington sun was already beginning to set, casting long, skeletal shadows through the ancient cedars. "Mom?" Chloe asked from the backseat, her voice small. "Why are the police at school? Are we in trouble?" Helen put the truck in park inside the garage and turned around. She needed Chloe to be compliant, but she couldn't afford to paralyze her with fear. "No, baby, we aren't in trouble," Helen said, her voice steady and warm. "But there's a bad man outside. And we're going to play a game tonight. It's called Castle. Have you ever played Castle?" Chloe shook her head, her blue eyes wide. "It's easy. The house is our castle. We lock all the doors. We turn out all the lights. And we set up a fort in the living room. But the number 1 rule of Castle is that you have to stay in the safe zone. No matter what you hear. Can you do that for me?" "Like hide and seek?" "Exactly like hide and seek. But we are going to be the absolute best hiders in the world." They went inside. The moment the heavy, reinforced steel door bolted shut behind them, Helen shifted into high gear. She moved through the cabin with practiced, lethal efficiency. First, the perimeter. She pulled the heavy blackout curtains closed over every window on the ground floor. She dragged a solid oak bookshelf in front of the sliding glass patio door, barricading the easiest point of entry. Next, the early warning system. Helen didn't rely on Wi-Fi security cameras. A smart predator could jam those with a $50 device bought online. She went old school. She retrieved a spool of high-tensile fishing line from her basement and rigged a series of tripwires across the front porch and the back deck. She attached the invisible lines to small, empty brass shell casings balanced precariously on the wooden railings. If a boot snagged the line, the brass would fall and clatter against the wood, a sound indistinguishable from the wind to an intruder. but an alarm bell to Helen. "Okay, Bug," Helen called out, walking into the living room. "Castle time." She helped Chloe drag her mattress from her bedroom into the center of the living room, specifically placing it in the dead angle between the stone fireplace and the heavy oak dining table. No line of sight from any window. Total ballistic cover. Helen handed Chloe her iPad, a pair of headphones, and a flashlight. "Safe zone. You don't leave this spot unless I tell you to. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Chloe said, giving a mock salute that made Helen's heart ache. Helen left Chloe in the fort and walked back to the kitchen. She opened the steel gun safe. She bypassed the 9mm Glock she had carried all day. Tonight wasn't for close-quarter sidearms. Tonight was for stopping power. Helen pulled out her customized AR-15 rifle. She checked the optics, turning on the red dot sight. She loaded 3 magazines with 5.56 hollow-point rounds. Slapping the first one into the magwell and racking the charging handle with a sharp, metallic clack, she slung the rifle over her shoulder and grabbed a pair of Generation 3 night vision goggles from the top shelf. By 7 p.m., the house was entirely dark. The heater was turned off to eliminate ambient noise. The only sound was the relentless pounding of the Washington rain against the roof. Helen sat in a high-backed leather chair in the corner of the living room, 15 feet away from Chloe's mattress. The chair was perfectly positioned in the shadows, giving her a clear, unobstructed view of both the front door and the hallway. She lowered the night vision goggles over her eyes. The living room instantly snapped into sharp, luminous shades of emerald green. She rested the AR-15 across her lap, her finger resting just outside the trigger guard. The police were out on the highway, looking for a ghost, but Helen knew the truth. The ghost wasn't on the highway anymore. He was coming here, to the deep woods, to finish the game he had started. Helen controlled her breathing. 4 seconds in, hold for 4. 4 seconds out. "I can take her whenever I want," the note had said. Helen stared through the green hue of the night vision, watching the reinforced front door. "Come and try," she whispered into the darkness. And then, just past midnight, she heard it. Clink, clatter. Outside on the front porch, one of the brass shell casings had just hit the wooden deck. Clink, clatter. The sound of the brass shell casing hitting the wooden deck was barely louder than a whisper against the drumming rain. But to Helen Parker, it sounded like a sonic boom. Sitting in the high-backed leather chair, enveloped in absolute darkness, Helen didn't flinch. Her breathing remained trapped in the steady, 4-second military cadence she had drilled into her muscle memory. Through the emerald green hue of her night vision goggles, the living room was a static, ghostly landscape. Behind the heavy oak dining table, Chloe was a small, steady lump under her blankets, her headphones firmly in place, entirely oblivious to the monster standing on their porch. Helen slowly, silently raised the barrel of the AR-15. She rested the stock against her shoulder, burying her cheek into the cold metal, aligning the red dot optic with the center mass of the reinforced front door. She waited. The heavy steel strike plate would hold against a battering ram, let alone a man's shoulder. If he tried to kick it, he would only break his own leg. Helen knew this, and deep down, she suspected he knew it too. This man was a tactician. He wouldn't brute force a primary entrance. Through the NVGs, Helen watched the heavy brass doorknob. Very slowly, agonizingly, the knob turned, A quarter inch. A half inch. Then it stopped, hitting the deadbolt. Silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. The intruder was standing mere inches away, separated only by 2 inches of solid oak. Helen could almost smell the sterile tang of gun oil and peppermint bleeding through the weather stripping. Then, the floorboards on the porch creaked. It was a subtle, shifting weight. He was moving away from the door. He's testing the perimeter, Helen thought, her eyes tracking the invisible sound as it moved right toward the side of the house. He's looking for the path of least resistance. 2 minutes later, a dull, metallic thud echoed from the exterior wall near the garage. Instantly, the faint, ambient hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen died. The digital clock on the microwave went black. He had cut the main power line. It was a classic psychological tactic. Kill the lights, plunge the victims into darkness, and let panic do the heavy lifting. But the killer didn't know the house was already dark. He didn't know he was dealing with a woman who owned the night. Helen slipped out of the leather chair. She moved across the hardwood floor in her socks, her footfalls completely silent. She bypassed the kitchen and positioned herself at the end of the short hallway, finding a lethal angle that covered both the sliding glass patio door and the kitchen windows. Clink! Another brass casing fell. This time, it was on the back deck. He was at the rear of the cabin. Helen pressed her back against the drywall, bringing the AR-15 up to eye level. Through the green phosphorus glow of her goggles, she stared at the heavy blackout curtains covering the sliding glass door. Scratch. Squeak. It was a strange, rhythmic sound pressing against the glass. Helen's tactical mind processed the audio instantly. It wasn't a crowbar. It wasn't a hammer. It was a glass cutter. He was scoring the pane, preparing to quietly pop the glass out of the frame using a suction cup so he wouldn't make a sound. Helen felt a cold, terrifying respect for the man outside. He was disciplined. He was quiet, but his discipline was about to get him killed. Helen didn't wait for him to finish. In close quarters combat, speed and violence of action were the only things that mattered. You never let the enemy dictate the terms of the breach. You dictate the breach. Cover your ears. Bug, Helen whispered to herself. She stepped out from the hallway, squared her shoulders, and aimed the AR-15 directly at the center of the blackout curtains where the scratching sound was originating. Helen squeezed the trigger. The roar of the 5.56 rifle in the enclosed space was absolutely deafening. A blinding flash of muzzle fire illuminated the living room like a lightning strike, temporarily whiting out her night vision goggles. Bang bang bang. Helen fired a controlled, 3-round burst. The high-velocity hollow-point rounds shredded through the heavy blackout curtains and shattered the sliding glass door into a million razor-sharp fragments. The deafening sound of breaking glass joined the ringing in Helen's ears. She didn't stop. She adjusted her aim 2 inches to the right, anticipating his evasive movement, and fired 3 more rounds. Bang bang bang. Cold, wet wind and the smell of gunpowder violently rushed into the cabin through the shattered door. The heavy oak bookshelf she had used as a barricade absorbed the falling glass. Helen immediately dropped to one knee, making her silhouette smaller, her rifle still trained on the gaping, jagged hole in the back of her house. Her night vision goggles readjusted, painting the destruction in sharp green relief. The curtains were torn to ribbons. The glass was gone. And the deck was empty. "Mom?" Chloe's voice shrieked from the living room fort. A sound of pure, unadulterated terror. The gunfire had bled right through her headphones. "Stay down. Chloe, do not move," Helen roared, her voice echoing with military authority. Helen kept her sights locked on the broken door. Her heart was a jackhammer against her ribs. Had she hit him? Did he drop? Then, a heavy, suppressed thwip sounded from the darkness outside. The dry wall 6 inches above Helen's head exploded in a cloud of white dust and plaster. Sniper. Helen threw herself flat onto the floor, low crawling violently backward into the cover of the hallway. Thwip, thwip. 2 more suppressed rounds tore through the kitchen cabinets, shattering ceramic plates and showering the floor with debris. The killer had retreated off the deck the second she fired, finding cover in the tree line. Now, he was shooting back with a sound-suppressed weapon. He was laying down covering fire. Helen popped out from the edge of the hallway, aiming blindly into the dark tree line beyond her backyard, and unleashed 5 rapid shots to force his head down. The booming echoes of her AR-15 rolled across the Snoqualmie Valley like thunder. No suppressed weapon could compete with the sheer, terrifying volume of unsuppressed 5.56 rounds. By now, the sound would be carrying for miles. Silence slammed back down on the cabin, heavy and ringing. Helen lay flat on her stomach, her finger off the trigger. Listening, the wind howled through the broken sliding door. The rain lashed against the wood. But there were no more suppressed shots. There were no footsteps on the deck. Far off in the distance, down on Route 119, the faint, high-pitched wail of police sirens began to rise through the fog. The neighbors half a mile away had definitely heard the gunfire. Sheriff Davis was coming. Helen slowly pushed herself up to a crouch, her weapon never leaving the shattered doorway. She waited 3 full minutes until the flashing red and blue lights of county cruisers began illuminating the trees at the bottom of her driveway. Only then did she flip up her night vision goggles and turn on her tactical flashlight. "Chloe?" Helen called out softly, moving backward toward the living room. "Bug, are you okay?" A small, trembling face peeked out from behind the mattress. Chloe was crying silently, her hands clamped over her ears. Helen slung her rifle behind her back and rushed forward, dropping to her knees and wrapping Chloe in a fierce, crushing hug. "It's okay. It's over. The bad man is gone. Mom chased him away." As she held her sobbing daughter, Helen looked over her shoulder, shining her flashlight beam through the living room, past the shredded curtains, and out onto the wet, wooden boards of the back deck. There, illuminated in the bright white circle of light, was a thick, dark smear of crimson blood. Helen had hit him. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was bleeding, and in the woods of the Pacific Northwest, a bleeding animal was a dead animal. The siege of the cabin was over. But as Helen stared at the blood on the deck, she knew with absolute certainty that the final hunt was just beginning. The flashing red and blue strobes of the county cruisers hit the front of Helen's cabin like a rave in a graveyard. The strobes painted the ancient cedars in frantic, jagged bursts of color, slicing through the freezing Washington rain. "Sheriff's Department, drop the weapon, hands in the air." The shouted commands came from the front porch, accompanied by the heavy, metallic thud of boots kicking the reinforced front door. They couldn't get through the steel strike plate Helen had installed, but they were trying. Helen didn't panic. She knew how easily blue-on-blue friendly fire could happen in the chaotic, adrenaline-soaked aftermath of a shootout. She quickly flipped the safety on her AR-15, popped the magazine out, and pulled the charging handle back to eject the live round from the chamber. The brass shell clattered harmlessly onto the hardwood floor. She placed the unloaded rifle on the kitchen island and raised her empty hands. "Coming out," Helen yelled, her voice a sharp, commanding bark that cut through the noise. "Friendly. Homeowner coming out." She unbolted the front door and pulled it open, instantly blinded by the glare of 3 tactical flashlights mounted on police shotguns. "Hold your fire. It's Helen," Sheriff Marcus Davis roared from the bottom of the porch steps, shoving a young, jittery deputy's barrel downward. Davis took the stairs 2 at a time, his chest heaving under his Kevlar vest, his eyes wide as he took in the smell of burnt cordite and plaster dust billowing out of the cabin. "Helen, are you hit?" Davis demanded, grabbing her by the shoulders, his flashlight sweeping over her face and clothes. "I'm clean," Helen said, her voice eerily calm compared to the frantic energy of the deputies swarming her property. "Chloe is safe. She's in the living room." Davis let out a breath that sounded like a deflating tire. He motioned for 2 deputies to clear the perimeter and stepped inside the cabin. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the living room. The heavy oak bookshelf was peppered with splintered holes. The blackout curtains hung in shredded ribbons. The sliding glass door was entirely gone, replaced by a jagged, gaping maw that let the howling wind and rain into the house. "Jesus Christ, Helen," Davis breathed, his flashlight beam catching the white plaster dust settling over the furniture. "It looks like Fallujah in here." He cut the power, tried to pop the glass out quietly. Helen stated, retrieving her AR-15 and slamming a fresh magazine into the magwell with a sharp clack. "I didn't let him finish the job." Davis walked slowly toward the back deck, his boots crunching on the sea of shattered safety glass. He shined his light out into the dark, rain-swept backyard. "Did you see him?" "Better," Helen said. She stepped past the sheriff, pointing the beam of her own tactical flashlight down at the wet wooden floorboards of the deck. Caught in the harsh white light was a thick, unmistakable smear of dark crimson. It was pooling in the grooves of the wood, slowly being diluted by the rain. A few feet away, on the edge of the deck leading into the grass, was another drop, and then another. "You hit him," Davis whispered, a mix of awe and terror in his voice. "You actually hit him." "Upper body, based on the height of the splatter," Helen analyzed coldly, her eyes tracking the droplets into the dark tree line. "Probably a grazing wound to the arm or shoulder. He had enough adrenaline to return fire with a suppressed weapon and exfil into the woods. But he's leaking, Marcus. He's leaving a trail." Davis immediately reached for the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch. This is Unit 1. Suspect is wounded and on foot. I need K-9 units. State Police tactical teams. And a chopper with FLIR in the air the second the sun comes up." He turned back to Helen. "We locked down the perimeter. Nobody goes into those woods until we have daylight and dogs." Helen looked at the older man, shaking her head slowly. "The rain is washing the blood away right now. Marcus, by the time your dogs get here at dawn, the trail will be gone. And he'll be in the wind. Or worse, he'll bleed out in a ravine and you'll never find out where he's keeping Sarah, Maria, and Jessica." "Helen, no, absolutely not." Davis stepped in front of her, using his broad frame to block the shattered doorway. "You are not going out there. You are a civilian. I am a mother who just had her home shot up by a serial killer." Helen's voice finally cracked, the raw, suppressed emotion bleeding through the soldier's mask. She pointed a trembling finger at the living room, where a female deputy was gently coaxing a tearful Chloe out from behind the mattress fort. "He came for my daughter, Marcus," Helen said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "He brought the war to my front porch. I am finishing it." Davis looked at the blood on the deck, then looked at Chloe, who was clutching her pink backpack like a shield. The sheriff closed his eyes for a long second. When he opened them, the strict lawman was gone, replaced by a man who understood the brutal reality of the world. "My armored SUV is parked at the bottom of the driveway," Davis said softly. "I will put Chloe in the backseat. I will lock the doors. And I will stand outside that truck with a 12-gauge shotgun until the sun comes up. Nobody touches her." Helen nodded, a profound sense of gratitude washing over her. "Thank you." Helen walked over to the mattress. She knelt in the plaster dust and broken glass, pulling Chloe into a fierce embrace. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She offered the truth. "You did so good, Bug. You stayed in the safe zone just like I asked." "Mommy, your house is broken," Chloe sniffled, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Houses can be fixed," Helen said, kissing Chloe's forehead, her thumbs wiping the tears from her daughter's cheeks. "Sheriff Davis is going to take you to his truck. It's like a tank. You're going to sit in there and play games on the iPad until the sun comes up." "Are you coming?" Chloe asked, her lower lip trembling. Helen looked into those innocent blue eyes, the same eyes that had kept her sane through the darkest nights of her deployments. "I have to go clean up the mess outside, Bug, but I promise you, cross my heart, I will be right back." Chloe nodded bravely, wrapping her small arms around Helen's neck for one last, desperate squeeze before taking the female deputy's hand. Helen watched them walk out the front door. Once she heard the heavy, armored doors of the sheriff's SUV slam shut at the bottom of the driveway. The mother vanished entirely. Helen walked back to her basement armory. It was 4 a.m. Dawn was an hour away. She stripped off her rain-soaked jacket and pulled on a lightweight, waterproof tactical chest rig. She packed it with 3 extra magazines, a blowout trauma kit with a tourniquet, and a pair of flex cuffs. She holstered her Glock 19 at her hip and picked up the AR-15. She walked back upstairs and stood at the shattered threshold of the sliding glass door. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy, silent fog rolling through the backyard. Helen didn't wait for the police dogs. She didn't wait for the state troopers. She stepped off the deck, her boots sinking into the wet mud, her eyes locking onto the faint, fading droplets of blood leading into the dark, towering evergreens. The ghost of Route 119 was bleeding, and the deadliest hunter in the Snoqualmie Valley was right behind him. The Snoqualmie Valley forest at 4:30 in the morning was not a quiet place. It was a living, breathing entity, dripping with freezing rain and shrouded in a thick, suffocating mist that clung to the giant ferns like spiderwebs. Helen Parker moved through the darkness like a phantom. Her night vision goggles were useless now. The dense canopy of the ancient evergreens and the heavy fog reflected the infrared light back into her eyes, creating a blinding green washout. She pushed the goggles up onto her helmet and relied on her naked eyes. Her tactical flashlight securely mounted to the rail of her AR-15, its beam cutting a sharp, white cone through the gloom. Head down, eyes open, follow the math. Tracking a man in the rain was a race against time. The water was actively erasing the story the killer had left behind. Helen didn't look for Hollywood-style puddles of blood, she knew better. She looked for the anomalies. She walked in a staggered, cautious crouch, her rifle always leading her eyes. She found the first sign 30 yards from the edge of her property. It was a broken huckleberry branch, snapped backward against the natural grain of the bush. Helen knelt, keeping her weapon shouldered, and shined her light on the underside of the broad green leaves, the only place protected from the downpour. There it was, a single, distinct smear of dark, oxidizing red. "You're dragging your right leg," Helen whispered to the wind, analyzing the height and angle of the blood transfer. The 5.56 round hadn't just grazed his arm. It had hit him hard enough to compromise his balance. Or a secondary fragment had caught him in the hip or thigh. A wounded animal was a slow animal. But a wounded predator was the most dangerous thing on Earth. Helen pushed deeper into the woods, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous as she climbed the ridge behind her cabin. Her own left knee, the one held together by VA-issued surgical steel, burned with a fiery, agonizing ache. She compartmentalized the pain, shoving it into a dark corner of her mind. This wasn't about her knee. This was about Chloe sitting in an armored SUV. And 3 women whose time was rapidly running out. 10 minutes later, the blood trail grew thicker. He was losing the fight against his own anatomy. The rain couldn't wash away the deep, desperate gouges his boots were leaving in the mud. His stride had shortened. He was stumbling. Suddenly, Helen stopped dead. She immediately dropped to one knee, bringing the AR-15 tight against her shoulder, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Her eyes scanned the dense wall of decaying cedar logs and thorny blackberry bushes ahead of her. The woods had gone entirely silent. The ambient noise of the forest, the rustling of small animals, the creaking of the high branches, had abruptly ceased. In combat, complete silence didn't mean you were safe. It meant the environment was holding its breath because a predator was near. Helen slowly panned her flashlight beam across the base of a massive, uprooted pine tree. Tucked into the hollow of the roots, shielded from the rain, was a pile of discarded tactical gear. Helen sliced the pie, moving laterally to keep her cover, until she had a clear view of the alcove. Empty. She approached cautiously, sweeping the muzzle of her rifle over the area before lowering it. Resting in the dirt was a heavy, black neoprene raincoat. It was slashed open at the right shoulder, the fabric heavily soaked in blood. Beside it lay a discarded, blood-soaked field dressing wrapper and an empty plastic syringe of what looked like military-grade clotting agent. He patched himself up, Helen realized, her jaw clenching. He's trying to stop the bleeding so he can move faster. But that wasn't what made the hair on the back of Helen's neck stand up. It was the placement of the raincoat. It was draped carefully over a jagged root, almost perfectly at chest height. From a distance, in the dark, it looked exactly like a man crouching in the shadows. It was a decoy. Snap. The sound came from the canopy above her. Helen didn't look up. Looking up took a fraction of a second too long. She threw her entire body weight backward, diving into the slick, freezing mud just as a heavy, dark shape dropped from the thick branches of the cedar tree directly over the decoy. A massive hunting knife, its blade entirely blackened to prevent glare, plunged into the dirt exactly where Helen's neck had been a millisecond before. The killer hadn't run, he had climbed. He had set the decoy, scaled the tree despite his gunshot wound, and waited for her to investigate the blood trail. Helen hit the mud hard, the breath knocked out of her lungs. But her military reflexes took over. She rolled aggressively to her right, bringing the AR-15 up. The man was massive, dressed head to toe in dark, tactical clothing, a black balaclava obscuring his face. His right shoulder was heavily wrapped in bloody gauze. He ripped the knife from the dirt with a guttural roar and lunged at her before she could fully shoulder her rifle. He batted the barrel of the AR-15 aside with his good arm. The rifle discharged into the dirt, bang, showering them both in mud and pine needles. The killer crashed into Helen, his sheer size and weight pinning her to the forest floor. The smell of bleach, copper blood, and peppermint overwhelmed her senses. He raised the blackened hunting knife high above his head, aiming straight for the center of her chest. Helen let go of the rifle grip. She didn't try to overpower him. Physics dictated she would lose that fight. Instead, she used his own downward momentum against him. As the knife descended, Helen brought both of her muddy boots up, planting them squarely into the man's stomach. She gripped the tactical vest he wore, pulled him forward, and violently kicked her legs out, executing a perfect, brutal sacrifice throw. The killer flew over her head, crashing heavily into the thorny underbrush behind her. Helen didn't wait to see how he landed. She scrambled to her feet, abandoning the tangled AR-15, and drew her 9mm Glock from her hip holster in one fluid, lightning-fast motion. She spun around, weapon raised, her tactical light blinding the space where he had landed. The brush was crushed, the blackberry thorns were broken. But the man was gone. He had rolled through the fall and vanished into the dense, foggy darkness of the ravine below, melting away like the ghost he pretended to be. Helen stood in the freezing rain, her chest heaving, the Glock trained on the empty blackness. She listened to the sound of his heavy boots sliding and crashing down the steep embankment, growing fainter and fainter until the sound was swallowed by the roar of the Snoqualmie River in the distance. She lowered her weapon slightly, wiping a mixture of rain and mud from her eyes. She had survived the ambush, but as she looked down at the edge of the ravine, her flashlight beam caught something metallic glinting in the mud where the killer had scrambled away. Helen walked over and picked it up. It was a heavy ring of keys. But they weren't car keys or house keys. They were heavy, brass, industrial padlocks, the kind used to secure shipping containers or heavy subterranean storm cellar doors. Attached to the ring was a small, laminated tag. Helen wiped the mud off with her thumb. Printed on the tag was a single word: Bunker 4 Old Mill Road. Helen's heart pounded a furious rhythm against her ribs. Old Mill Road was an abandoned logging facility 5 miles deep in the valley. It had been shut down for 20 years. He hadn't just dropped his keys in the scuffle. He had dropped the map to his hunting grounds. Helen looked back toward her cabin, where she knew Sheriff Davis was waiting with her daughter. Then, she looked down into the dark, foggy ravine. The police were waiting for dawn. But Sarah, Maria, and Jessica didn't have until dawn. Helen holstered her Glock, picked up her muddy AR-15, and checked the action. "Hold on," Helen whispered to the missing women, her voice hard as steel. "I'm coming." Helen Parker didn't hike back to her shattered cabin. She knew Sheriff Marcus Davis. He was a good man. But he was bound by the rigid, bureaucratic chains of law enforcement. If she walked out of those woods and handed him the keys to Bunker 4, he would call the state police, set up a command tent, and wait for daylight to execute a SWAT raid. By the time they breached the doors, the monster would have either bled out in the woods, or he would have triggered a dead man switch inside the bunker to erase his evidence. Erasing the evidence meant erasing Sarah, Maria, and Jessica. Helen couldn't let that happen. Moving parallel to her property line, keeping a wide berth from the strobing red and blue lights of the police cruisers out front, Helen slipped toward the small, detached woodshed hidden behind a thick grove of rhododendrons at the rear of her land. She bypassed the heavy padlock, she never kept it locked, and slipped inside the dry, cedar-scented dark. Sitting in the corner, covered by a canvas tarp, was her heavily modified, matte black electric hunting bike. It had fat, all-terrain tires and a silent, high-torque motor. It was designed for quietly tracking elk deep in the Cascades. But tonight, it was her chariot into hell. Helen strapped her AR-15 to the front handlebars, checked the battery indicator, fully charged, and quietly wheeled the heavy bike out the back door. She didn't turn it on until she had pushed it half a mile through the dense brush, putting a solid wall of timber between herself and the police blockade. When she finally twisted the throttle, the electric motor whined with a low, barely audible hum. Helen shot forward into the dark, navigating the treacherous, washed-out logging trails by the faint, ambient moonlight filtering through the fog. The ride to Old Mill Road was a grueling, 5-mile fight against the mountain. The freezing rain whipped against her face like shards of glass. Her left knee throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic pulse where she had hyperextended it during the fight in the mud. But the heavy, brass keys jingling in her tactical vest pocket drove her forward. 30 minutes later, the dense wall of pine trees suddenly gave way to a massive, barren clearing. Helen squeezed the brakes, sliding the bike to a halt behind a rusted-out, overturned bulldozer. She killed the power and dismounted, unclipping her AR-15 and raising it to her shoulder. Welcome to Old Mill Road. It was an industrial graveyard. The sprawling facility had been abandoned in the late 90s when the timber boom busted. Massive, skeletal steel cranes loomed in the fog like dead dinosaurs. Corrugated metal roofs had collapsed in on themselves, and giant, rusted saw blades the size of minivans lay half buried in the toxic, blackened soil. The silence here was different from the woods. It wasn't the quiet of nature holding its breath, it was the dead, hollow silence of a tomb. Helen flipped her night vision goggles back down over her eyes. The graveyard of iron snapped into a vivid, glowing green. Bunker 4, she whispered, her breath misting in the air. During the Cold War, the logging companies out here had built subterranean concrete storage bunkers to house volatile blasting caps and industrial chemicals, keeping them safe from forest fires. Helen moved methodically through the ruins. She cleared a crumbling administrative building, sweeping the corners with the barrel of her rifle. Empty. She bypassed a massive, rotting lumber kiln. Nothing. Then, at the far northern edge of the compound, pressed up against a sheer rock cliff face, she saw it. It was a large, concrete loading dock that had been completely swallowed by decades of overgrown blackberry bushes. But the brush in the center of the dock had been recently and meticulously hacked away. Helen approached, her boots making no sound on the wet concrete. Set directly into the ground was a pair of heavy, slanted steel cellar doors. They were thick, Industrial-grade iron, heavily pitted with rust, but the hasp holding them shut was brand new. And looping through that hasp was a massive, brass industrial padlock. Helen pulled the key ring from her vest. Her hands, steady as stone during the gunfight, now trembled slightly. She knelt beside the heavy steel doors. She inserted the brass key into the padlock. Click. The lock popped open with a heavy, metallic finality. Helen pulled the padlock free and set it silently on the concrete. She gripped the rusted iron handle of the right door and heaved upward. The hinges screamed in protest, a harsh, grinding squeal that echoed across the abandoned mill. Helen froze, sweeping her rifle behind her, expecting the wounded killer to lunge from the shadows. But nothing moved. He wasn't here. He was still out in the woods, bleeding and running. She looked down into the gaping black hole she had just uncovered. A set of steep, concrete stairs descended into absolute darkness. A wave of stale, freezing air washed up over her, bringing with it a smell that made Helen's stomach turn over. It was the smell of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the sterile, terrifying scent of bleach and peppermint. Helen reached up and clicked on her weapon-mounted tactical light, turning off the NVGs so she wouldn't be blinded by close-quarters glare. The white beam of her flashlight pierced the gloom, illuminating the bottom of the stairs. She raised her AR-15, taking a deep breath to steady her racing heart. She wasn't Helen Parker, the single mother from King County anymore. She was Sergeant Parker, and she was going in. She took the first step down into the dark. "Sarah? Maria? Jessica?" Helen called out, her voice echoing off the concrete walls, sounding horribly small in the belly of the earth. "My name is Helen. I'm coming down. Do not be afraid." From the absolute pitch black at the bottom of the stairs, a sound drifted up to meet her. It was a soft, muffled sob, and then, the faint, desperate rattle of heavy metal chains. The descent into Bunker 4 was a masterclass in controlled terror. With every concrete step Helen Parker took, the temperature dropped, the air grew thick, stagnant, and heavy with the metallic scent of rust and the stinging, sterile odor of bleach. The white beam of her weapon-mounted tactical light sliced through the pitch-black void, revealing cinder-block walls slick with decades of condensation. 15 steps down, Helen counted silently, a perfect fatal funnel. If the killer were waiting at the bottom, she would be completely exposed, silhouetted against the faint gray light of the open cellar doors behind her. But her instincts, honed by years of surviving the unthinkable, told her the bunker was empty of the predator. He was still out there in the freezing rain, nursing a 5.56 gunshot wound. Still, a man who smeared petroleum jelly on zip ties and carved tally marks into trees did not leave his sanctuary undefended. Helen paused on the 16th step. Her flashlight beam caught a faint, unnatural glimmer stretching across the stairwell, exactly 6 inches above the concrete tread. She knelt, lowering her AR-15 slightly. It was a tripwire, not the thick, clumsy fishing line she had used on her porch, but a thread of monofilament so thin it was virtually invisible to the naked eye. She traced the line to the right wall, where it vanished into a small, drilled hole in the cinder block. Peeking out from the hole was the unmistakable brass rim of a 12-gauge shotgun shell, rigged to a spring-loaded firing pin. A kneecapper. If she had rushed down in the dark, the blast would have severed her femoral artery, leaving her to bleed out on the stairs in a matter of minutes. "You're a clever son of a bitch," Helen whispered, her voice devoid of fear, replaced entirely by cold, clinical hatred. She stepped carefully over the wire, clearing the last 3 steps. She stood in a narrow, concrete antechamber. Facing her was a heavy, reinforced steel security door. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault. Painted appealing, industrial gray, a thick steel deadbolt secured it. Helen pulled the heavy ring of brass keys from her vest. She found a large, square-headed key that matched the profile of the lock. She inserted it, turning it with a heavy, satisfying clunk. She gripped the handle, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The main holding area of Bunker 4 was a waking nightmare. The room was roughly 20 by 20 feet, illuminated by a single, bare, low-wattage bulb dangling from the ceiling. The floor was covered in cheap, industrial rubber mats. In the corner sat a chemical toilet and a stack of bottled water. But it was the center of the room that made Helen's breath catch in her throat. Bolted to the concrete floor were 3 heavy iron rings. Attached to those rings were thick, galvanized steel chains, and at the end of those chains were 3 women. They were huddled together on a pile of dirty sleeping bags, shivering violently in the damp cold. When the heavy steel door swung open, they flinched in unison, burying their faces in their hands, letting out muffled, terrified whimpers. "Please," one of them begged, her voice raw and broken. "Please, no more." Helen immediately lowered her AR-15, letting it hang on its tactical sling. She raised her empty hands, stepping fully into the dim light. "Sarah? Maria? Jessica?" Helen said, her voice soft, projecting the absolute warmth and authority of a mother. The 3 women slowly raised their heads. They looked like ghosts. Their faces were hollow, their eyes wide with trauma and exhaustion. Around their wrists and ankles were the heavy-duty plastic zip ties, thickly coated in translucent petroleum jelly just like the one Helen had found on the highway. The woman closest to the front, Jessica Thorne, the waitress who had vanished yesterday, stared at Helen's tactical vest and the rifles slung across her chest. Who are you?" Jessica choked out. "Are you a cop?" "My name is Helen. I'm a mom, and I'm here to take you girls home." A collective, shuddering gasp ripped through the room. Maria Lopez, the nursing student, burst into violent, uncontrollable sobs, burying her face against Sarah's shoulder. Helen didn't waste a single second. She moved quickly across the rubber mats, dropping to her knees beside the women. She pulled the heavy cob bar knife from her hip. "Keep your hands steady," Helen instructed, gently taking Jessica's trembling wrists. "This blade is sharp, but I've done this 100 times. You're going to feel a little pressure. And then you're free." Helen slid the blackened steel of the knife under the thick plastic zip tie, twisting her wrist with calculated force. The heavy plastic snapped with a sharp crack. Jessica let out a cry of relief, instantly wrapping her freed arms around herself. Helen moved to Maria, then to Sarah, methodically snapping the restraints. "Can you all walk?" Helen asked, her eyes scanning their legs for injuries. "He hit my house tonight. The police are swarming my property 5 miles from here. We need to move now." He's coming back," Sarah Evans whispered, her eyes darting wildly toward the open steel door. "He said he was going to get a little girl. He said he was bringing us a daughter." Helen's blood ran to absolute ice. The sheer, unadulterated evil of this man's plan crystallized in her mind. "He tried," Helen said, her voice dropping to a low, Lethal register. But he failed. I shot him. He's bleeding out in the woods right now. The women stared at her, a spark of desperate hope finally breaking through the terror in their eyes. Helen stood up, unslinging her AR-15. Okay, listen to me. We are going to walk up those stairs. You will step exactly where I step. There is a tripwire on the bottom stair. Do not touch it. She helped Maria to her feet, supporting the younger woman's weight. Jessica and Sarah held onto each other. Stay behind me. Stay quiet, Helen ordered, transitioning back into the squad leader she used to be. They moved out of the holding room and into the narrow antechamber. Helen illuminated the stairs with her flashlight, pointing out the nearly invisible monofilament wire. Step over. High knees, Helen whispered. One by one, the women cleared the trap. Helen took the rear, her rifle aimed back into the dark bunker, ensuring nothing was following them from the shadows. They reached the middle of the staircase. The cold, fresh air of the Pacific Northwest morning poured down from the open cellar doors above them, smelling of rain and wet pine. It was the smell of freedom. Jessica, leading the group, let out a breathless laugh, tears streaming down her face as she saw the gray light of dawn breaking through the fog above. We're going to make it, Jessica cried softly. Oh my God, we're actually going to. Clang. The sound was deafening, a massive, metallic explosion that echoed down the concrete stairwell like a bomb going off. The gray light vanished. The fresh air was instantly cut off. The heavy, slanted iron cellar doors at the top of the stairs had just been violently slammed shut. Helen threw herself forward, pushing the screaming women against the wall as the heavy steel deadbolt on the outside of the doors slid shut with a sickening final thud. Absolute, suffocating darkness swallowed them. Helen clicked her tactical light back on, the beam shaking wildly for the first time all night. She aimed it up at the sealed iron doors. Through the thick metal, a muffled, ragged voice drifted down into the bunker. It was a voice thick with pain, dripping with dark amusement. You fight good, Mommy, the voice wheezed, but you broke the first rule of the trap. You never walk into the cage to save the mice. Helen stared up at the sealed doors. The killer hadn't run blindly into the woods. He had known she would find the keys. He had tracked her to Old Mill Road. Helen Parker had just locked herself in the devil's cage. The heavy iron doors at the top of the stairs slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Instantly, Bunker 4 plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness, broken only by the sharp white beam of Helen's tactical flashlight slicing wildly across the concrete walls. Behind her, the fragile composure of the three rescued women shattered completely. Maria screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure terror that echoed violently in the confined stairwell. Jessica dropped to her knees, her hands clawing at her own hair, hyperventilating as the reality of their entrapment set in. Sarah pressed her back against the cinderblock wall, sliding down to the floor, her eyes wide and vacant in the harsh flashlight beam. Hey, look at me, Helen commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. It wasn't the soft, comforting tone of a mother anymore. It was the iron-clad bark of a combat sergeant. Look at the light, all of you, right now. The sheer, overwhelming authority in Helen's voice cut through their panic. 3 pairs of terrified, tear-streaked eyes snapped to Helen. Panic is a luxury we do not have, Helen stated, stepping back down the stairs to stand at eye level with them. She kept her flashlight trained on her own chest so they could see her face without being blinded. Panic consumes oxygen. It clouds your judgment. You survived this monster for months. Do not let him break you in the last 5 minutes. We breathe. 4 seconds in. Hold for 4. 4 out. Do it with me. Helen forced her own breathing into a slow, rhythmic cadence. Hesitantly, shuddering violently, the women followed her lead. Good, Helen said, her voice softening just a fraction. Now, stay behind the tripwire. I'm going to assess the doors. Helen turned and marched back up the concrete steps. She slung her AR-15 over her shoulder and pressed her hands flat against the cold, rusted iron of the cellar doors. She pushed with her legs, using the leverage of the stairs. The steel didn't give a single millimeter. Outside, she could hear the heavy, dragging footsteps of the killer moving across the concrete loading dock. You can push all you want, Mommy. His muffled voice rasped through the thick iron. It sounded wet and ragged. Helen had definitely hit a lung or an artery. It's a 2-inch steel deadbolt. You're not getting out. Helen didn't answer him. Engaging in psychological warfare with a psychopath was a waste of breath. Clank. Screech. A new sound drifted down from the ceiling of the bunker. It was the sound of heavy rocks and wet earth being violently kicked across metal grates. What is he doing? Jessica whispered from the bottom of the stairs, her voice trembling. Helen shined her light up at the 2 small, 6-inch PVC ventilation pipes protruding from the ceiling near the doors. Dirt and mud suddenly began raining down through the pipes, followed by the muffled thud of heavy rocks being piled on top of the exterior exhaust vents. He was sealing the bunker's air supply. He's burying us, Sarah choked out. Helen did the math in her head. A 20 by 20 subterranean room. 4 breathing adults. The ambient oxygen would be converted to toxic carbon dioxide in less than 3 hours. Long before that, hypoxia would set in, dizziness, confusion, and eventually, unconsciousness. He's trying to, Helen corrected, turning her back to the iron doors. But he forgot who he locked in here with you. Helen descended the stairs, stopping precisely at the 16th step. She knelt beside the shotgun tripwire trap she had bypassed earlier. Jessica, I need you to be my hands, Helen said, looking down at the women. Come up here. Step exactly where I stepped. Jessica hesitated, swallowing hard, before slowly climbing the stairs, her eyes fixed on Helen's boots. Hold this. Helen handed Jessica the tactical flashlight, illuminating the rigged 12-gauge shotgun shell wedged into the cinder block. Keep the beam steady right on the brass rim. Helen pulled her bar knife from her hip. With surgical precision, she pinched the invisible monofilament wire with her left thumb and forefinger, maintaining the tension so the spring-loaded firing pin wouldn't snap forward. With her right hand, she slid the razor-sharp blackened blade against the wire. Snip. The wire separated. Helen slowly, agonizingly, eased the tension off the firing pin, locking it back into a safe position. She reached into the hole and pulled out the 12-gauge shell. It was a heavy, 3-inch magnum slug. Okay, step back down, Helen ordered. Helen moved to the bottom of the stairs. She set the shotgun shell on the floor. Then, she ejected the magazine from her AR-15. She pressed her thumb against the top of the magazine, stripping out 10 brass 5.56 rounds, letting them clatter onto the rubber mats. What are you doing? Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. Chemistry, Helen replied. "Shooting those iron doors will just cause the bullets to ricochet down this stairwell and kill us. We need to blow the deadbolt entirely out of the concrete frame. I need an explosive breach." Using a pair of heavy pliers from her tactical vest, Helen meticulously unseated the copper bullets from the brass casings of the 5.56 rounds. She poured the fine, black smokeless gunpowder onto a dry piece of fabric she cut from her own jacket. Next, she carefully sliced open the plastic hull of the 12-gauge shotgun shell, pouring its massive payload of powder into the pile. "I have the explosive," Helen muttered, her mind racing through the demolition protocols she had learned at Fort Benning. "But I need to direct the blast. If I just detonate this against the door, the energy will take the path of least resistance, straight backward into this stairwell." She looked at the chemical toilet, then at the stack of bottled water the killer had left for his victims. Water tamping, Helen realized, a grim smile touching the corner of her lips. "Maria, Sarah, grab 4 bottles of water. Empty half of the water out of each. And pack the rest of the bottles with the wettest, heaviest mud you can scrape from the bottom of our boots and the stairwell treads. Pack them tight." The women didn't question her. The sheer, focused momentum of Helen's actions was infectious. They went to work, scraping mud and filling the plastic bottles. Helen took the pile of gunpowder and tightly wrapped it in the fabric, creating a localized, dense charge. She cut the primer, the small, circular explosive cap at the base of the shotgun shell, and embedded it into the center of her makeshift bomb. "Done," Maria said, handing Helen the 4 heavy, mud and water-filled plastic bottles. "Perfect. Everybody, back into the holding room. Get behind the heavy steel security door. Do not come out until I give the all-clear." Helen climbed the stairs one last time. She pressed her ear against the iron doors. The sound of scraping dirt had stopped. The killer was either resting, or he had bled out on the concrete dock above. She took a roll of black tactical tape from her vest. She taped the concentrated gunpowder charge directly over the seam of the right iron door, exactly where the heavy exterior deadbolt was located. Then, she took the 4 heavy water bottles and taped them tightly around and behind the charge. Water is non-compressible. In an explosion, a water-tamped charge forces the expanding kinetic energy of the blast to seek a different direction. It would force the explosion straight forward, through the iron and into the deadbolt, acting like a battering ram of pure pressure. Helen backed down the stairs. She stopped at the heavy steel security door of the inner vault, where the 3 women were huddled together. "Cover your ears. Open your mouths slightly so the pressure wave doesn't rupture your eardrums," Helen instructed. She drew her 9mm Glock from her hip. She stood at the edge of the thick steel doorframe, using it as hard ballistic cover. She aimed the bright green tritium night sights of her pistol up the dark stairwell, perfectly aligning them with the tiny, exposed brass primer of the shotgun shell embedded in her bomb. It was a tough shot. 40 feet, upward angle, in near darkness, but Helen had spent thousands of hours on the range, firing until her fingers bled. "Knock, knock," Helen whispered. She squeezed the trigger. Crack. The 9mm bullet struck the shotgun primer dead center. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. A blinding, localized flash of orange fire illuminated the entire stairwell. The deafening, concussive boom shook the bunker to its very foundations, dislodging decades of dust from the cinderblock ceiling. The water tamp charge worked perfectly. Instead of a fireball rolling down the stairs, the kinetic energy punched violently forward. The heavy exterior deadbolt didn't just break, it sheared entirely off the iron frame. The twin cellar doors were violently blown upward, slamming back against the concrete loading dock with a massive, ringing clash of heavy metal. Thick, white smoke filled the stairwell. But cutting through the smoke, pouring down into the pitch-black belly of the beast, was the beautiful, pale blue light of the Washington morning. Fresh air rushed into the bunker. Jessica, Maria, and Sarah let out a collective scream of absolute, unbridled joy. But Helen didn't celebrate. She kept her Glock raised, her eyes narrowing as she stared up through the dissipating smoke at the rectangular patch of gray sky. The doors were open, but the war wasn't over. Because silhouetted against the dawn light, standing at the very top of the stairs and staring down into the smoking crater, was the massive, hulking frame of the killer. And this time, he was holding a rifle of his own. The thick, acrid smoke from the breached doors churned in the narrow concrete stairwell, turning the dawn light into a swirling, milky haze. At the top of the stairs, the massive silhouette of the killer blocked the sky. He didn't monologue, he didn't hesitate. The monster of Route 119 raised a heavy, scoped hunting rifle to his uninjured shoulder and blindly pulled the trigger. Boom! The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. A high-caliber round slammed into the cinderblock wall just 3 inches from Helen's head, showering her face and tactical vest with razor-sharp concrete shrapnel. "Get back in the vault! Now!" Helen roared over her shoulder, physically shoving Jessica backward into the holding room. She slammed the heavy steel inner door shut, locking the 3 women safely behind an inch of impenetrable iron. Helen was alone in the stairwell. She pressed her back flat against the cold wall, making herself as small a target as possible. She dropped her empty AR-15 magazine to the rubber mats, smoothly drawing a fresh one from her chest rig and slapping it into the magwell. She slapped the bolt catch. Clack! A fresh 5.56 round slid into the chamber. Boom! Another round tore through the smoke, this one ricocheting violently off the concrete steps and sparking against the steel door behind her. He was shooting blind, using suppressing fire to keep her pinned at the bottom of the fatal funnel while the smoke cleared. He had the high ground. He had the light behind him. By all tactical metrics, he had the advantage. But Helen had something he didn't. She had the dark. Helen reached up with her left hand, her thumb finding the toggle switch on her weapon-mounted tactical flashlight. She didn't click it to a steady beam. She pushed the switch forward, engaging the strobe function. A blinding, 1,000 lumen LED light erupted from the barrel of her rifle, flashing violently at 15 Hz per second. The strobe effect turned the churning white smoke into a blinding, disorienting rave. It destroyed depth perception and shattered the killer's night-adjusted vision. "Ah!" the killer grunted. A wet, ragged sound of pain and frustration drifting down the stairs as he instinctively shielded his eyes with his good arm. That was all the opening Helen needed. She didn't run up the center of the stairs. She sidestepped out from the wall, raising her AR-15, her right eye locking onto the glowing red dot of her optic. Through the strobing, chaotic light, she found center mass. Helen squeezed the trigger. Twice. Bang bang. The controlled double tap echoed like a thunderclap. At the top of the stairs, The massive silhouette jerked backward violently. The heavy hunting rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the concrete loading dock above. For a split second, the killer stood suspended against the pale blue dawn. Then, his knees buckled. He fell forward, tumbling down the steep, concrete steps. His massive body crashed heavily against the cinderblock walls, a chaotic tangle of dark tactical gear and limbs, until he slammed into the rubber mats at the absolute bottom of the stairwell, coming to rest just 2 feet away from Helen's combat boots. Helen immediately stepped back, keeping her rifle trained flawlessly on his chest. She clicked her flashlight off strobe, casting a steady, harsh white beam over the fallen predator. He was lying on his back, gasping wetly for air. The dark raincoat was soaked in fresh blood. His black balaclava had torn during the fall, revealing the pale, unremarkable face of a man in his late 30s. He didn't look like a monster. He looked entirely ordinary. That was the most terrifying part of all. He coughed, a terrible, rattling sound, and his eyes locked onto Helen. Slowly, agonizingly, his right hand twitched. He reached toward the sheath on his tactical belt, his thick, neoprene-gloved fingers wrapping around the handle of the blackened Ka-Bar hunting knife he had tried to kill her with in the woods. "Don't do it," Helen commanded, her voice devoid of anger, fear, or malice. It was cold. It was absolute. "I will end you right here." The killer grinned, a blood-stained, horrific smile. You're just a." He didn't finish the sentence. He violently ripped the knife from its sheath, lunging upward with the last desperate ounce of his strength. Helen didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She pulled the trigger one final time. The single 5.56 round struck him square in the chest. The killer's body went completely rigid, the knife slipping harmlessly from his grasp, clattering onto the cold concrete. He fell back onto the rubber mats, his vacant eyes staring up at the smoke-filled ceiling. He didn't move again. Silence rushed back into Bunker 4, thick and ringing. Helen stood perfectly still for 10 seconds, her rifle trained on the body, making absolutely sure the threat was neutralized. When she was certain, she engaged the safety on her AR-15 and let it hang from its sling. She turned around and faced the heavy steel security door. Helen reached out and threw the deadbolt. She pulled the door open. Inside the dim holding room, Jessica, Maria, and Sarah were huddled together, weeping silently, terrified of what they might find when the door opened. When they saw Helen standing there, covered in plaster dust, mud, and gunpowder, but entirely unharmed, a collective, shuddering breath left their lungs. "It's over," Helen said softly, stepping aside and gesturing up the concrete stairs, toward the rectangular patch of open sky. "He's gone. Come on, let's get you girls into the sun." Helen helped Maria to her feet, while Jessica supported Sarah. They walked out of the holding room, stepping carefully over the body of the monster who had stolen their lives. None of them looked down at him. They kept their eyes fixed upward. When they finally breached the surface, stepping out onto the rusted concrete loading dock of the abandoned mill, the Pacific Northwest morning greeted them. The freezing rain had finally stopped. The thick fog was breaking apart, revealing the towering, majestic evergreens of the Snoqualmie Valley bathed in the golden, fragile light of dawn. Jessica collapsed to her knees, tilting her face up to the sky, letting the cold morning air wash over her as she sobbed openly. Sarah and Maria knelt beside her, wrapping their arms around each other. A tangle of shared survival and overwhelming relief. Helen stood a few feet away, keeping a perimeter watch, though she knew the woods were finally safe. She reached into her chest rig and pulled out her cell phone. The screen was cracked, but she had a single bar of signal this high up the mountain. She hit speed dial. It rang exactly once. "Helen?" Sheriff Marcus Davis's voice barked through the speaker. Frantic and breathless. "Helen, where the hell are you? I've got state troopers at your house. The K-9s lost the blood trail at the ravine. Call off the dogs." "Marcus," Helen said, her voice exhausted but deeply peaceful. She looked at the three women bathed in the morning sun. "Send your medics to the abandoned logging facility on Old Mill Road." "Bunker 4. Old Mill Road? Did you find him? Helen, what's your status?" Helen smiled, a genuine, warm smile that finally reached her eyes. "The target is neutralized," Helen reported, slipping back into the familiar cadence of a soldier coming home. "And I have 3 civilians with me. They need blankets, Marcus, and they need to call their families. We're waiting for you." Far off in the distance, down in the valley, the faint, beautiful sound of sirens began to rise through the trees. The hunt was finally over. The abandoned logging facility on Old Mill Road was no longer a graveyard of iron. By 7 a.m., it had transformed into a sprawling, chaotic command center. The rhythmic, chopping roar of a state police medevac helicopter vibrating through the evergreens signaled the end of the nightmare. Paramedics swarmed the concrete loading dock, wrapping Jessica, Maria, and Sarah in thick, reflective mylar thermal blankets. Helen Parker stood a few yards away, leaning heavily against the rusted frame of an overturned bulldozer. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the long, violent night was finally beginning to evaporate, leaving behind a bone-deep, crushing exhaustion. Her waterproof jacket was torn. Her hands were covered in mud and drywall dust, and her left knee throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony. She watched as the EMTs gently guided the 3 women toward the waiting ambulances. Just before she stepped up into the back of the rig, Jessica Thorne stopped. She pulled the foil blanket tight around her shoulders, turned around, and looked at Helen. Jessica didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just placed a trembling hand over her heart and bowed her head in a silent, profound gesture of gratitude. Helen offered a small, exhausted nod in return. "Mission accomplished, Parker." Helen turned to see Sheriff Marcus Davis pushing his way through the perimeter of yellow police tape. He looked entirely wrecked, his uniform rumpled from standing guard all night, but his eyes were wide with absolute disbelief as he took in the scene. He looked at the 3 ambulances. He looked at the smoking, shattered iron doors of Bunker 4. And then he looked at Helen. "The tactical boys are clearing the basement right now," Davis said, his voice dropping to a low, reverent rumble as he stopped beside her. "They found him at the bottom of the stairs." "Helen, how did you do this? How did you even find this place?" Helen unclipped her heavy tactical chest rig, letting it drop to the wet grass with a heavy thud. She slung her AR-15 over her shoulder, the barrel pointing safely toward the dirt. "He got sloppy, Marcus," Helen said simply, looking out at the rising sun. "He thought he was hunting victims. He didn't realize he was leaving a trail." Davis shook his head, running a hand over his graying hair. "The FBI is going to have 100 questions for you. The media is already parking news vans at the bottom of the mountain. You're about to be front-page news from Seattle to D.C." "No," Helen said, her tone suddenly sharp, the soldier flashing in her eyes one last time. I'm not doing interviews. I'm not doing press conferences. You can tell the FBI whatever they want to hear, Marcus, but leave my name out of the papers. Tell them a local deputy found the bunker. Tell them an anonymous tip came in. I don't care. Davis frowned. Helen, you're a hero. You saved 3 lives. I am a mother, Helen corrected softly. And I have a daughter waiting for me. Davis's expression softened. He reached into his pocket and tossed her a set of heavy car keys. She's safe. She's asleep in the back of my armored SUV. Right where I promised you she would be. Deputy Miller is standing guard. Go home, Helen. Thank you, Marcus. The drive back down Route 119 felt entirely different in the daylight. The heavy, suffocating fog that usually choked the Snoqualmie Valley had burned off, chased away by the bright, piercing rays of the morning sun. The towering Douglas firs didn't look like silent sentinels hiding monsters anymore, they just looked like trees. Helen parked Davis's SUV at the bottom of her long dirt driveway. Her own house was still taped off as a crime scene, the shattered sliding glass door flapping in the wind, but she didn't care about the broken glass or the bullet holes in the drywall. She killed the engine and stepped out of the truck. Deputy Miller, standing faithfully by the rear door, offered her a crisp salute. Helen returned it, stepping past him to open the heavy, armored rear door. Curled up on the leather backseat, clutching her pink backpack and fast asleep, was Chloe. She was still wearing her bright yellow rain boots. Helen's breath caught in her throat. The sight of that tiny, peaceful face instantly shattered the remaining ice around her heart. She dropped to her knees in the damp gravel, burying her face in the upholstery, and finally let the tears fall. She cried for the women who had suffered in the dark. She cried for the agonizing terror of the night. And she cried out of sheer, overwhelming relief. The sound of her quiet sobs stirred the little girl. Chloe blinked, rubbing her blue eyes sleepily. "Mom?" Chloe mumbled, sitting up. Helen hastily wiped her face with the back of her dirty sleeve and offered the biggest, brightest smile she could muster. "Hey, Bug, good morning. Are we done playing castle?" Chloe asked, looking around the interior of the police truck. "Yeah, baby," Helen said, reaching out to gently brush a lock of brown hair behind Chloe's ear. "We're done playing castle. We won." Chloe unbuckled her seatbelt and launched herself out of the truck, throwing her arms around Helen's neck. Helen caught her, standing up despite the burning pain in her knee, holding her daughter so tight she thought her ribs might crack. She buried her face in Chloe's neck, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo, letting it wash away the phantom smells of bleach and gunpowder. "I'm hungry," Chloe announced pragmatically, resting her chin on Helen's shoulder. "Can we have toast?" Helen let out a wet, genuine laugh that echoed brightly through the morning air. "Copy that, soldier," Helen said, kissing her cheek, "but I make no promises about not burning it." 1 month later, the smell of burnt toast and drip coffee drifted through the Pacific Northwest kitchen. Outside the window, the Washington State morning was bright and crisp. The heavy oak bookshelf had been moved back to its proper place. And a brand new, reinforced sliding glass door offered a clear, beautiful view of the backyard. Helen stood at the counter, wearing a comfortable gray sweater, watching a local news broadcast on a small countertop TV. And today marks the 1-month anniversary of the miraculous rescue of Sarah Evans. Maria Lopez, and Jessica Thorne. The news anchor reported. While authorities remained tight-lipped about the exact details of the raid on the Old Mill Road bunker. Sheriff Marcus Davis confirmed today that the perpetrator acted alone and the threat to the Snoqualmie Valley is permanently neutralized. Helen reached out and casually turned the television off. She didn't need to hear the rest. "Mom, it's smoking," Chloe called out from the dining table, pointing a small finger at the toaster. Helen blinked, pulling her gaze away from the window. She looked down at the charred square of wheat bread popping up from the machine. She offered a small, crooked smile. "Tactical error. Bug," Helen said, smoothly sliding the ruined toast into the trash and dropping 2 fresh slices into the slot. "Peanut butter this time?" "Copy that," Chloe cheered, swinging her legs under the table. She wasn't wearing her yellow rain boots today. Today, the sun was shining. Helen leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip of her coffee. She looked out at the dense, towering evergreens bordering her property. She knew there would always be shadows in the world. She knew there would always be monsters lurking in the dark corners. But as she looked at her daughter, safe and smiling in the warm light of the kitchen, Helen Parker knew something else with absolute certainty. Let the monsters come, she would always be ready.